Hi, welcome back to the next episode in my NHL Deep Dive series. Today we are talking about the Ottawa Senators, and is this finally the year where the Senators break through and finally make the playoffs? The rebuild was supposed to end like 6 years ago, but we're still here. And I actually like overall what this team did this summer. It was a pretty aggressive offseason for the Sens, and it began with the forward core, and they add David Perron, Noah Gregor, and Michael Amadio. They also bring in Nick Cousins, who I don't have on this slide because I made the slide before he signed, and then it was the whole thing. It's fine. He's not there. But he did bring him in. They lose Dominic Kubley, Parker Kelly, Matthew Joseph. Those are really the three big losses for this team. So I think it's pretty easily an upgraded unit. I mean, David Perron on his own is easily better than anybody they brought um, in that window, and he basically replaces what Vlad Tarasenko was before they traded him at the deadline. So I like it. I think you add that depth piece, you have another year of everybody else kind of being there. They don't lose a whole lot up front. It's a pretty solid upgrade for the Sens there. Defensively is where things get interesting. They lose Eric Brandstrom and Jacob Chikrin being the biggest move. They add Nick Jensen. Now, on based on just value, this unit got worse. However, they kind of had too many Jacob Chikrin like players, and they needed to bring in a more defensively responsible defenseman. And I think they get that Nick Jensen. Now, do I think Nick Jensen's like the best defensive defenseman out there? No, but he does give them a bit of an edge that they didn't have before, at least defensively. So in that sense, I think it actually does work for what the team needed. But I think, obviously talent wise, Jacob Chikrin's easily better than Nick Jensen. And they lose out on some of that talent there. So they're downgraded in that sense. But I do like the fit of Nick Jensen in this unit. And finally, in net, I mean, it's probably the biggest upgrade in net in the NHL, period. And it's Linus Ullmark for Jonas Korpisalo. And I mean, Ullmark, we haven't seen him have to run his own tandem really lately. I mean, his best years have been with Swayman. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how that dynamic works. But overall, I mean, I don't know if you can look at this team and say anything other than it's a massive upgrade uh offensively or in net. So overall, like I really like what the Sens did this summer. I think they upgraded and they addressed some needs. And that moves us into this offense. And up front, you kind of have your big three of Stützle, Kachuk, and Giroux, all of which I have at A minus. And I really like all three of these guys, man. I mean, I think I should start by talking about the third guy on this board, which is Claude Giroux, who just doesn't seem to age. I mean, he has been consistently, basically since even his last year in Philly, he's been one of the most underrated wingers in the NHL. His play driving ability still hasn't fallen off at all. Um, his offense is still there. He's still going to be, a very consistent point getter, and he really does fit as the third guy in this unit. And you kind of look at the rest of this team. I mean, people love to hate on the Kachuk brothers, but Brady Kachuk kind of has that tenacity and has that like physical edge to his game. And I think he's just a perfect fit for this line on the other side, basically, for being a different type of player. And finally, obviously, Tim Stützle, who so far looks like the slam dunk pick from that draft, at least in the top three. And he's really developed into that number one center role really nicely. So overall, like you have this first line that's really set up, and it's very similar to Detroit in the fact that like they finally have kind of their top end secured, and now it's just about filling out everything else. And that's where I think the Sens kind of start to lack. For me, this is the unit that kind of slips um depth wise for me for this team. And you have guys like Drake Batherson and David Perron, who I really like. I think they're good complementary pieces kind of below that top line. But other than that, like I do have questions, right? Like I need to see another step from Ridley Gregg, who had a solid season last season. Shane Pinto is another guy who needs to find consistency when he's playing. And and Josh Norris in the same kind of boat. So I think if all three of those guys can kind of find more consistent play and hit their ceilings more, then the Senators are going to be fair. They're going to be fine and they're going to be a playoff team. That's kind of the question mark for me. But that's kind of the biggest issue for me is can this team find consistency in that bottom six? Because even guys like a David Perron has had stretches where he hasn't looked like a top six forward, and he'll have stretches where he looks really good. So Drake Batherson, I think outside of that top line is easily like the most secure guy for this team. And it's just about finding another two or three guys to fill the rest of that top six out and then kind of fall into the depth of the rest of the roster. That's where I'm at here. Depth wise, I mean, you have McEwen, you have Gregor, you have Nick Cousins, who they also just signed. That's fine. Like, that's good enough. Michael Amadio, too, I really like. So, the depth wise, like in the bottom, like fourth line and a bit of the third line, I actually don't mind. It's just kind of that middle six area where the Sens really need to figure out their identity below that top line. And I think they have the guys to do it. I mean, we've seen, Josh Norris look like a top six forward. We've seen Shane Pinto look like a second line center. Ridley Gregg had flashes last year where he looked very good and he looked comfortable in that role. Obviously, David Perron, I think, is somebody they'd rather play as like a supplemental scorer, power play guy. And that's where I see him kind of fitting. I think they give Josh Norris kind of the opportunity to break in that top six. Same with Pinto and Gregg even. And obviously Drake Batherson's there too. But if they fail, you can slide Perron up and then see how things go from there. So overall, like I have them tied for 15th. I think it's a middle of the pack looking offense. It's very similar to Detroit, actually. Like this team's very, at least offensively, is very similar to Detroit. I think they're better in other groups, but offensively, it's very much like your top line is secure. For Ottawa, I think their fourth line, like kind of their depth pieces are pretty secure. It's just figuring out where everybody else fits in that top six. And if they can answer that question and they can figure that out, then the Sens should be a playoff team this year. That's basically what it comes down to for me offensively. Um, you look at the blue line, and it's a blue line that that got worse, ratings wise. I have them tied for 12, and it's led by two guys I really like. And Jake Sanderson gets a lot of the hype on this blue line now. He's definitely become the best defenseman in this unit. He's definitely their 1A guy. And offensively, he's become a lot more dynamic. He's pretty defensively responsible, especially for a defenseman his age. The player I want to talk about more is Thomas Chabot, because I feel like Thomas Chabot has recently been thrown under the bus by Sens fans. And I'm not quite sure why. I don't I still see Thomas Chabot as a legitimate like first pair defenseman, as a guy who can be, the best defenseman with a supporting cast. And I was kind of hoping that if they were going to move out a blue liner, it was going to be Chabot so he can go somewhere and kind of be that dynamic player. And I think now that they've moved out Chikrin, Chabot's role is also going to increase. So you might see him fall back into being kind of the defenseman he was a couple years ago, at least role wise, because he won't have to split it as much with two other defensemen that are very similar to him stylistically. I think that was kind of the problem in Ottawa, because although I think they got worse talent wise, I actually think they improved based on fit, and at least in the top four. The bottom pair of this blue line is what I worry about. Tyler Clevin, obviously, we haven't really seen play, and Jacob Bernard Docker is pretty much a fringe NHL defenseman at this point. They need to be able to step up and develop. And you're kind of throwing them to the Wolves if that is what they end up doing in the bottom pair. Even if you do move guys around, I still think you're kind of throwing those guys to the Wolves, not having much of a safety net behind them. Roster wise, I mean, they have Travis Hand. Like they don't have, there's nothing there. Let's be honest. Um, but again, like I like Nick Jensen, I like Artem Zub. Both those guys are very nice complementary players, especially for guys like Sanderson and Chabot. I really think this is the year that Thomas Chabot kind of falls back into favor with Sens fans. And I hope so, because I really like Thomas Chabot, obviously. My biggest concern on this blue line is the depth. It's again, right? Like I worry about that third pair. I worry about those two younger players. Clevin's looked, competent when in like the games that he's played, especially outside the NHL. But it's a lot to put on a team that's trying to make the playoffs without having a safety net. So I think if I'm the Senators and I'm kind of looking forward to the deadline, and if we're competing for a playoff spot, I think picking up a bottom six defenseman and a middle six forward are kind of the areas of need for this roster. But the big thing for Ottawa is that they were able to improve in net, and that is going to help this blue line look better, right? I have this tandem tied for fourth. There's a bunch of teams tied for fourth. Just based on the way the math works, there's only two players involved, so it's harder to have separation like there is for forwards and defense. There's a bunch of teams tied for fourth, but Ottawa is one of them. And Linus Olmark has been one of the best goalies in the NHL of the last little bit. I think he's been slightly overrated because of that Bruins system. I still have him as an A, obviously, but like the Vezina year, he wasn't my Vezina pick that year. So like I don't see him as a top five goalie in the NHL. I see him closer to like the 10th best goalie in the NHL. But he's still very good. Like there's that's not to say that he isn't good, but I just think he's been slightly overrated a little bit because of the system that he played in and the team that the defense he was in front of. And I think we could see an Allmark decline. I don't decline's a strong word, but a bit of a step back because this blue line isn't going to be as defensively responsible, and the forwards aren't going to be as defensively responsible as they were in Boston. Behind him is Anton Forsberg, who's been fine as a backup, and I think giving him a smaller role will actually help him look better. In the same way that like a Laurent Brossoit has looked a lot better playing behind an elite goalie than he did his 1 year in Vegas. I think like Anton Forsberg, somebody who you give him 25 games, he's going to look a lot better as a backup than he would if he's playing 35. So that in that case, I think it's going to help being in a situation where they do have a bell cow goalie in front of them. And Olmark has played as a true number one goalie before. So I have less concerns about him than I do about like a Jeremy Swayman, who we'll talk about soon. Overall, the Sens have a couple holes on their roster, and that's what concerns me. That's why they're where they are right now. And I do think they have the players internally to answer those questions, right? Like I think you could see Clevin and Bernard Docker become a fifth and sixth defenseman, and then the blue line's fine, right? You could see, Shane Pinto and Josh Norris and Ridley Gregg compete for second line minutes, and then that problem's solved, right? And all of a sudden, their forward core looks way better. But those are still questions. And in an Eastern Conference where I think there's a bunch of teams logjam kind of in this bubble team area, the team that can figure out how to answer those questions first is the team that's going to make the playoffs. I don't know if I'm going to have the Sens making it when I before my in my preseason standings predictions, but they're close. This is the closest this team's been. They were aggressive this summer. They got their goalie. They addressed the defensive liability issue on the blue line, and they replaced Tarasenko with Perron, which is like your power play depth specialist kind of player. So I think they did a good enough job trying to fix some of the issues, right? And obviously, goaltending was the biggest one, and they went out and they addressed that with Allmark. If they can get answers to those other areas, then the team's in the playoffs. And that's the question. That's the big question. I don't know if I'd have them in yet. I'm not confident either way, but they're going to be close. They're going to be in the bubble team. They're going to be battling for a spot come March, early April. I just don't know if they have enough players internally to answer all those questions. But we'll see. But yeah, that is the Ottawa Senators deep dive. And overall, I mean, I like a lot of the players on this team. I like kind of their top end talent. It's just those questions. That's the big, and that's what it's going to be like for a lot of these teams. In this stage of the rankings is there's a lot of like teams that have like one or two big glaring issues that need to be solved before I can truly believe in them as a legitimate playoff team. But yeah, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, like the video, let me know what you think of the Ottawa Senators down below, and we will see you in the next one, which should be out very shortly. But make sure you like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss it. And we're getting there. The series is coming along. I have about less than a month now to do it. So this episode's gonna be fired out. Thanks for watching.